It is imperative that the Trail of Tears Association ensure that the record of what was done to the First Nations of the southeastern United States remains as relevant a story today as it was 180 years ago.
An amazing story that the people, the ancestors of the Eastern Band, purposefully enacted and saw their way all the way through all the suffering that it took to remain here.
The Cherokee wanted to create, they wanted to communicate with themselves, but most importantly, they wanted to communicate with the world.
So ancestral Cherokee people are cosmopolitan people. They had deep and wide social networks.
One disillusioned soldier wrote that he was paid to commit a crime, to defend a fraudulent treaty with, in his words, the vilest machinations man or demon could invent.
And if you understand the Trail of Tears, and if you don't forget the Trail of Tears, when you go on to study just what happened in the 19th century after the Cherokee people got to their new homelands, picked themselves back up, and rebuilt a great society and a great democracy and a government built on the rule of law.
We don't do this to shame or blame. We do it because it's an opportunity for us to say to the world, our ancestors persevered. They had tenacity and resilience. They refused to be victims. They rebuilt the Cherokee Nation.
So I think that y'all should give yourselves a round of applause for all that you've accomplished in the last 25 years.
You didn't sign up to be warriors in this battle. Your efforts to speak plainly about the Trail of Tears, to preserve the history, helps push back on this nonsense. So we are bringing back the history course for the Cherokee people, by the Cherokee people, so that this generation of Cherokees coming up will know their own history.
Well, Jack, and well, for clarifying the Constitution Convention to which we served. That was, though, I hope, impactful in a positive way on the Cherokee people, but I can tell you it was impactful on me as a younger person, and serving with Jack Baker was really one of the great joys of my time so far in public service, and serving really with him on some important missions has also been, Jack, very impactful on me, and hopefully we are making an impact collectively with all of you and so many friends across the country. I am very proud to be with you again, and I know it's been a while since you've gathered in person, and I know you're concluding what I have heard has been a wonderful conference, and it does my heart good just to see you all gathered up together in person again, because the mission you're on is incredibly important. It's a mission that I support. It's a mission the Cherokee Nation supports. My wife, our First Lady, who is also a friend of your efforts, sends her regrets that she couldn't be with us, but she's here in spirit. We'll be here at a future conference. I understand you'll be in the great Cherokee Nation 1 year from now. That also makes me very proud. We know, and I know that I'm speaking to people who know this well. I think it's always important to remark upon it that over 180 years ago, the United States inflicted injury and injustice on the Cherokee people. We have to say it, and we have to repeat it, and we have to be plain about it, even though people in this room not only know it, but live and breathe the history and do so much to keep it relevant, to keep it in the minds of the country. That's important, but it is important to say it. And we ought to also acknowledge that our forced removal inflicted trauma upon the Cherokee people that in many ways still sticks with us today. We're still laboring under
those events, those actions, those injustices that were leveled upon our ancestors. In 1987, the Congress of the United States made a promise to preserve the history of the Trail of Tears. What an important moment that was. What an important piece of legislation that was, establishing the Trail of Tears as a national historic site. That also helps the country remember, ensures that the country doesn't forget. The Congress made a promise. It was a promise, again, to not forget, a promise to preserve, a promise to keep in the public consciousness what happened to our Cherokee ancestors now coming on 2 centuries ago. And such, I think, vital work by the Congress. But what I think is most significant for the Cherokee people to know, and really the country to know, that the work of keeping that promise, keeping the Trail of Tears in the public consciousness, making sure a generation of young people in this country grow up understanding what happened to the Cherokee people, whether they're Cherokee or not, and in many ways, especially if they're not Cherokee, understanding that part of Cherokee history. That is really the work of all of us. It ought to be considered the work and the responsibility of every American to understand that part of the history and to share it and to deepen the country's collective understanding of the impact of the Trail of Tears. But the men and women who have been most entrusted with what I think is a really important mission, and that is keeping the promise that the Congress made in 1987, are the men and women in this room, and the men and women who have served this organization since its founding in 1993. What you do is incredibly important work, and it's an aspiration for me that everyone in this country ought to consider it part of their duties as a citizen of this country to remember that part of history. I know, as a practical matter, we've got a lot of work to do before every American understands that and embraces it, passes it on to the generation coming up. It falls squarely upon the shoulders of the men and women in this room, those that came before you, those that will come after you in this organization, to make sure that this country doesn't forget. What you do to help maintain and preserve the physical aspects of the Trail of Tears, the pieces of the Trail of Tears that still remain. There's still physical evidence of it, the artifacts, the placement of signs and memorial. That work is incredibly important. But I think just as important, if not more important, is what you do to keep this important part of our history in the consciousness of this country. In many ways, you serve as part of the conscience of this country. Because if you don't do it, if we don't do it as Cherokee people, if our friends and allies don't do it, no one else is really going to do it for us. It's important that we keep that chapter alive. And I want you to know that I think that the work you do honors our ancestors. And I know there's many Cherokees in this room, and you're honoring your own ancestors. I also know there are non-Cherokees in this room who feel passionately about the mission of this organization. And I want you to know that you honor our ancestors. And I want you to know something else from me. As Chief of the Cherokee Nation, I think what you're doing is also a gift to generations of Cherokees yet to come. The work you're doing today, the labor that you're undertaking at this conference and in all the days in between to the next conference and the next conference, really is work that you may not fully see the fruits of, but it will bear fruit, and it'll bear fruit for generations to come in the form of preserving history, preserving historic places, and keeping what happened to our people alive. You keep this in the public consciousness. You also do something else. If sometimes people may ask me, and do ask me, what would I want people to know about the Cherokee Nation? Because the truth is, as hard as you work and as hard as we work at the Cherokee Nation, there is a huge deficit of knowledge in this country about Cherokee history, Native history, and where tribes have a role today and where they historically had a role within this country and on this continent. But people sometimes ask me, what would you want Cherokees or even the rest of the world to know about the Cherokee Nation? And yes, I want them to know that over 180 years ago, the trauma that was imposed on our people by our forced removal, I want them to know, I want them to say it, and I want them to remember it. But I also know that that serves as a context for the second thing that I want them to know, and that is the story of the Cherokee comeback. The story of the Cherokee people rebuilding is one of the great stories of triumph in the history of this world, and the Cherokee people did it. And if you understand the Trail of Tears, and if you don't forget the Trail of Tears, when you go on to study just what happened in the 19th century after the Cherokee people got to their new homelands, picked themselves back up, and rebuilt a great society and a great democracy and a government built on the rule of law, folks, that ought to fill each and every one of us with pride, whether we're Cherokee or not. Every American ought to be proud of that. And they ought to honor the Cherokee people for it. And so much of the reason that more Cherokees and more people in this country than ever know about this history, even though we've got our work cut out for us, is because of the work of the men and women in this room. And I suspect that, like so many people who work hard at something and put their all into something, you may find yourself too close to it to recognize what a national impact you are having. But rest assured, from me, from my perspective, you are having an impact felt across this country, and you've got my admiration. Reminding the country of that part of American history and Cherokee history, I think, is more important now than it's ever been. And here's why I think that. I think it because there is a disturbing movement in this country to whitewash American history. There are a few loud voices in this country that would just as soon wipe away the chapters of American history because they might make somebody feel bad. They might make some people in the country be full of regret. These chapters might make us collectively as Americans hang our head and wonder why we did it. Talking about the forced removal of Native peoples, the destruction of one of the great democracies on this continent, and that's the Cherokee Nation before our removal. A trauma that imposed not only hardship and destroyed governing institutions and split Cherokee people politically, but also cost the lives of thousands, 4,000 men, women, children, grandmas, grandpas, grandbabies, all because of a failed federal Indian policy that said we ought to move the Indian problem across the map. There are people in this country that view that type of history as history that's just too critical of the United States, and we ought not to talk about it, and we sure shouldn't talk about it in our public schools, and we cannot have a generation of young people coming up feeling bad about a chapter in history, in American history. My friends, that is an effort that is underway in this country, and it is affecting something very precious in this country, and that is the minds of young people. Now, I think that there's not a nation on the face of this earth that prospers by suppressing its own story, even when that story is difficult to tell. And I think every nation in this world, including the United States, is a stronger nation if we'll just embrace every chapter of our history, if we say it plain and we say it factual and we own up to it and we stare into it together and recognize that sometimes history does make us collectively feel bad. Sometimes it does collectively fill us with regret. Sometimes the United States might say we're a great country, but we didn't do great on this particular instance or that particular chapter of history. There's not a thing in the world wrong with that, and yet there is an effort in this country, whether it's banning books or scrubbing curriculum clean of dark chapters, it's happening in this country. It's even happening back in my home state, the state of Oklahoma. You didn't sign up to be warriors in this battle. You signed up to further the cause of preserving history. This is not a political organization. I recognize that, and that's one of the reasons you're so effective. But the truth of the matter is, your efforts to speak plainly about the Trail of Tears, to preserve the history, helps push back on this nonsense that somehow the country will be better if we just stop talking about the dark and difficult chapters that might make us collectively feel bad. Your efforts do that, and that's very important to me as Chief of the Cherokee Nation, because I see across the country marginalized populations being diminished and their part in the American story being scrubbed away. I see that happening, and I don't want that to happen to the Cherokee people. I don't want that to happen to Native peoples, and that's why I speak up and I speak out about it, and that's why I've chosen to share these remarks with you. Not to spur you to action, but to thank you for your actions. Because what you're doing to inform the public of this important part of Cherokee history, I think is how we get better as a country. We ought to be a country that does better when we know better. And the only way to collectively know better is to talk about American history. And we sure ought to talk about it with the generation that's coming up. And millions of school kids deserve it. So for that, you also have my thanks and my admiration. Now, Cherokee Nation, we are making, I think, bigger strides than ever to help tell the Cherokee story. You all are doing incredible work. I think we're doing good work as well. Years ago, we decided we had seen enough history books that relegated us to a couple of paragraphs or a footnote, so we wrote our own history book. And that's not a bad way to help take back the narrative and to help inform the country about the basics of Cherokee history. We are bringing back something for the Cherokee people that I think has been absent for too long. And I think when we had it, and Councilor Julia Coates, who's with us, started that before she was a council member. And I can tell you ever since I've served the Cherokee people in different capacities, whether it's at home or across the country, what I've heard from the Cherokee people is they have a hunger to know their own history. And that history course that Councilor Coates started was very impactful, very meaningful, and missed. So we are bringing back the history course for the Cherokee people, by the Cherokee people, so that this generation of Cherokees coming up will know their own history. We have in the reservation, boy, doesn't it feel good to say Cherokee Nation Reservation? Feels good every time I say it. Just about everybody agrees that that's a good thing. There's a few that don't. But we outnumber them, I am convinced. We have great museums back home, and most of you probably have visited our museums, and you'll be going back next year and you'll get a chance to see what I think is one of the great museums in all of Indian country, the Cherokee Nation History Museum. It's in our Capitol building, our 19th century Capitol building. It is full of wonderful exhibits. It's a great opportunity to expand your own knowledge about Cherokee history and hopefully introduce that to some folks who've never been to that museum. We also have, of course, something we miss, which is the Heritage Center. If you go there now, the Heritage Center is closed. That makes us sad, but what fills us with hope is that in 2020, the Deputy Chief and I proposed to the Council the Cherokee Heritage Act. It was unanimously approved. We are on a mission to reimagine and rebuild that Heritage Center to make it the premier research and history center in this country for the Cherokee people. And in a few years, that will come to reality. And you don't have to have confidence in it because this elected official suggests you do. Just know that we put Jack Baker on the committee to make sure it gets done. I wanted to ask Jack Baker if he had time to serve on another committee, and they said, don't even ask him. Just put him on there, and he'll show up. But Jack and the others on that committee on that Cherokee National Historical Society Advisory Committee will really help create something that I think all of you will be proud of. A couple of more subjects to address. The Deputy Chief and I are putting to the Council something called the Artist Recovery Act. So much of Cherokee history and culture is reflected in our art. We have so many talented artists. They have taken it on the chin in the past few years because of COVID. It's been difficult to get to art galleries. Some have gone virtual, and some of our artists are not able to access the stream of commerce that is selling art during a pandemic, and they have lost a lot. And the other thing is we've got this generation of talented young people, and they're going to choose a path in life, and for them to choose a path of creating beautiful Cherokee art is something we have to seize upon right now. So I have sent to the Council a piece of legislation that will commit $3 million to invest in our Cherokee artists. We are going to, in some ways, revitalize Cherokee culture just by getting behind wonderful Cherokee artists. And one of them's on the front row here, Cherokee National Treasure, Tommy Wildcat. Tommy, I'm glad you're here with us, but Tommy's one of so many creative people in the Cherokee Nation that are doing great things. We just need to get behind them as a government. That is something that I think by the time you join us next year, you will see very present in the Cherokee Nation in terms of more art created, more art available. And that, I think, is one of the ways you strengthen any society. Finally, let me say this. I have scolded the United States a bit during my remarks, haven't I? I do that from time to time. I can't help myself. But I think for a good reason. There are some people in this country, and I mean it, that would rather we not talk about some of the subjects we're talking about. And I preach it, I suppose, that we ought to embrace every chapter of our history, but you know, they say you've got to practice what you preach. And I am proud to tell you that when you go to the Cherokee Museum of History, the Cherokee Nation Museum of History, when you walk in the next year, you will see a very important exhibit. It's an exhibit that makes us as Cherokee leaders and Cherokee people face our own dark chapter in our history. And it's something we've got to do. And doing it has actually made us, I believe from the bottom of my heart, a stronger nation. Doing it means that when I talk to my daughter on this subject, I can tell she's mystified that this was ever an issue. And I think about her, and I think about my grandchildren. Can you believe I've got grandchildren at this point? I think about my grandchildren, and I hope they're completely mystified that this was ever an issue, and I hope they're proud when they look back at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, and that the Cherokee Nation put an exhibit to freedmen descendants in the Cherokee National History Museum. It was the right thing to do, and it practices what we preach when I say we've got to face the dark chapters in our history. We've got to embrace them. We'll be a stronger Cherokee Nation, just as the United States is a stronger country. Thanks to each and every one of you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much. Wado.